what we're talking about in this session is consumer sovereignty, and what this is actually going to be is a case where Mises and Rothbard disagreed with each other. So, don't let people tell you that we're a cult or something, that we, worship Mises. Actually, we worship Rothbard. He is the true prophet, and we'll see that Mises went awry until Rothbard had to correct him. All right. So, now, in all seriousness, this is an interesting concept or case, because clearly the insights that Mises gives here, what I'm going to talk about, his notion of consumer sovereignty, and that term actually he got from Hutt, H-U-T-T. That's not a term that Mises coined. This idea that Mises discusses in Human Action and plenty other places of consumer sovereignty, you'll see as we go through it that it's clearly a very Austrian understanding of the market process. And in fact, if you didn't have this, it's not clear that as a classical liberal you would support the market economy, all right? Or even just as like a nice guy, you probably wouldn't support the market economy. But so you can see why. I think Israel Kirzner used to say this at NYU, that really this notion of consumer sovereignty really was the reason Mises was so passionate about the market economy. And yet, we'll see Rothbard raises some serious, I think, objections, both in terms of political implications and also just pure economic analysis. All right, so it's an interesting case where you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but it's difficult to reconcile the two. And I actually, one time if you're trying to think of a paper, this could be a good one to work on, as something to contribute to an Austrian journal. Obviously, the AER is not going to care about this, but the Austrians would. That trying to reconcile the two, because as you'll see, Rothbard almost seems too sterile, that you would be missing the insights of this. So it's almost like you need to read Mises and then see why it's not quite right. Okay, so where does this term consumer sovereignty come from, and why did Mises want to stress it? I think to understand it, you need to realize the context in which Mises spent most of his career. That the socialists, one of their catchphrases was saying that we want to have economic democracy. Okay, because in terms of the political realm, why would democracy spread and why was it so popular with the masses? Obviously, because the idea was, you had these entrenched interests before, the landed aristocracy or whatever country you were in, whoever the elites were, and then democracy comes along and redistributes the power. It takes the power out of the hands of the few and showers it to everyone, one vote, one man. Okay, so that is spreading through the world, and then the socialists come along and say, okay, yeah, we all see why political democracy is a great innovation, and it was just times of barbarism before, where just the few got to rule over the many, and so let's apply that same revolution to economic arrangements. And so why in the world would we have these few capitalists who own everything, all the tractors and all the factories and so on? Why are we all subservient to them? That's basically the same thing as what we just fought for in the political realm. So we want to have economic democracy, and that's what socialism is, right? So that's the appeal that the socialists were making. And so I think partly to understand why Mises chose the terminology he did, you got to realize he was trying to show that no, don't be seduced by these promises. In fact, what they mean by, or what they're describing, the reason that sounds appealing, that's actually what a market economy does, if anything. But certainly you wouldn't get that under socialism. Under socialism is really where the elites are going to control how much bread you have and who lives or dies, or who has to go work in Siberia, right? So it's socialism is not what you want to champion if you're concerned about a few people having incredible amounts of power over the masses. So in describing how the market economy works, Mises said he uses this term consumer sovereignty, and he says that it's misleading. A lot of people think in a market economy that it's the capitalists who are in charge. And so, because if you think through it, you say, well, clearly the workers aren't in charge. The average, either even skilled, but especially unskilled laborer is not deciding what gets done in a market economy. They show up at work and their boss tells them what to do when they do it. And if they don't do it, they get fired. All right, and so clearly the workers aren't running the show. You say, so maybe their bosses are. And you could say, well, no, because they report to somebody, and you can keep going up the chain of command, and you might even say, it's the CEO. Well, no, it's the shareholders, right? And so ultimately, it goes up the chain of command, and it seems as if to people that the capitalists are the ones in charge, and that's why it's called capitalism, because it seems like it's the system geared towards, satisfying the whims of the capitalists. That's the reason Marx chose that term, because he thought it was a smear. But Mises says, no, it's actually not the shareholders who are ultimately in charge. It's true, they're the ones who make the final decision as to, the shareholders of a car company. They're the ones who ultimately, put the people in charge who make the decisions as to how many models are we going to release, or, are we going to paint the cars a certain color, or how many airbags are we going to put in, right? So they are the ones nominally in charge, but ultimately Mises says they're subservient themselves to the consumers, that if the consumers stop buying their products, they go out of business. And so even though they might own the company, that's a sort of an empty title to have if no one's buying the company's products. So to give you a silly example, you say, well, gee, why don't car companies produce, cars that are pink with red polka dots? Suppose the shareholders just really happen to like that color arrangement. Why won't they crank out thousands of cars like that? And the obvious answer is because nobody would buy them. That even if the owners do have a slight preference in that regard, they're eccentric, let's say, their eccentricity is not so big that they're willing to throw away all the, millions of dollars in profits they could have if they just tried to make a car that most people wanted to buy. Alright, so you see that even though technically they had the legal ability under a capitalist system to make whatever they want, the market profit and, price system guides them to serve the masses. So Mises says that, the distinctive feature of the Industrial Revolution and mass production is that it was mass production for the masses. And if you think about it, the standard socialist interpretation of the Industrial Revolution, how it was just this huge, horrible epic that, impoverished everybody and was awful. I mean, it's a little bit odd when the way the capitalists allegedly enslaved everybody was building these giant machines and factories that cranked out thousands of products for the masses. You don't need to you don't need to mass produce something that's going to go to be a luxury item for the very rich, right? If you're mass producing something, you're producing it for the masses. And so that's just another way of seeing the way it's true. So there are hyper rich people in a capitalist society, and they live at a standard of living that we can't even comprehend. But the way they get to that position, unless they have, special political connections, the way in a pure market economy they get to be at that high level of a fantastic standard of living is they have to serve the masses, right? So by getting up to that level of wealth, they're actually providing goods and services for everybody. So that's the idea, and Mises, to try to drive home the analogy with democracy, says things like, in a market, every penny that's spent is a vote cast in favor of that line of production. All right, so the idea is that, in a sense, Mises thinks that everybody who has dollars, that's basically how many votes they have, and then they go out, and he says the election, or the plebiscite, as he says it, is conducted every day on the market economy. And the consumers evaluate every day who's doing a good job using society's scarce resources and which entrepreneurs are doing a poor job. And we have daily elections, or actually, every time you buy something, that's a mini election. And that's, and the people collectively who are spending more money on one line, that's in a sense the consumer's way of saying you're doing a good job, keep it up. And if they stop spending money on another line, they're saying, you're squandering resources. Now this is actually a subtle point. It's not merely if people spend money on one thing versus another. It has to do with the calculation problem, and it's this, sort of interesting interaction between the prices of the factors of production and the consumer prices. So let me just give you a sort of a silly example to motivate it. We know if you built an apartment and you coated all the interior walls with solid gold, that would be incredibly wasteful. Right? You just know that can't be the right use of scarce resources. But specifically, how would that manifest itself in practice in a market economy? How would market prices let us know that that's crazy if we didn't know it intuitively? Suppose some entrepreneurs is, saying, let's think outside the box. Why don't we coat the apartment with gold? No one's ever done that before. Maybe it's because they just never thought of it. No one was as audacious as we were. And so the accountant or whoever would go through and he would show, well, no, the reason we're not going to do that. It's true. It would be a big buzz, especially if we did a, ad campaign, and we could charge higher rents. A given apartment that's equivalent in all other respects to what the person down the street, their apartment has, same square footage, same view, all that stuff. But ours, the interior is coated with solid gold, yeah, that probably would be a selling point. Or maybe, it would be tasteful. You wouldn't just have it just be completely gaudy, gold in certain areas. But it would look like, a sultan lives here. And for those who want to be a sultan. So so they could certainly find people who would be willing to pay a lot more per month to live in that apartment than, just think of it. You bring a date home, you turn on Barry White, and it's all solid gold in the apartment. That'd be great. All right. So certainly there are people who would pay more for that. Okay. So it's not a matter of just, the consumers would penalize you. They would stop spending money on your product. That's not, no, the consumers would pay more for that. That is an subjectively perceived cooler, good to see, an apartment coated with gold. But the reason you wouldn't do that is because the increment in how much you could charge would not cover the increment in production costs. All right? That because you would have to use the gold, whereas your competitor down the street is using, wallpaper, and that's a lot cheaper given the current market prices. And so, the person running the numbers would show the guy, he said, yeah, there's no matter how much more we brought in here, there's no way that would compensate for the extra cost of production. And so it wouldn't be profitable to do that. We would lose money doing that. So that's why we don't do it. And let me just show you a diagram to show Mises' idea here of how the profit and loss test interacts with consumer sovereignty and his understanding of what it is that the entrepreneurs do. Because he says they're actually the mandatories of the consumer, meaning they're like agents acting on behalf of the consumers. That's the way Mises thought of things in the market. So what he had in mind is up here, you've got the owners of the factors of production. Land, labor, and capital goods. All right, so there's people up here who own these things. And then down here, you've got the consumers. Whoops. Let me put them up here. Consumers moved up a little bit. All right, you guys see everybody? Okay. And then in between them, you've got the entrepreneurs. And what they do in a market economy is they, take money and they buy units of land, labor, and capital goods. So they give dollars to these people, and those people sell them, their labor power, or they rent out their capital goods, or they rent out their land. And then the entrepreneurs take those things, they combine them into different goods and services, and then sell them to the consumers. And the consumers, of course, give them money, and so on. Okay, so the idea is that, what does it mean when we say that it would be unprofitable for this entrepreneur to make a gold apartment in exchange for money? Right? So there's some consumers over here. This entrepreneur is selling him or renting to him the gold-plated apartment, and he's given money in return. Why is that a bad thing that we want to discontinue? We don't want that to persist. The reason is that gold should go somewhere else, right? That really there's some other entrepreneur who's making, jewelry in exchange for money. So there's other consumers who are going to jewelry stores buying gold necklaces and gold rings and earrings, and they're handing over dollar bills for those things. And these entrepreneurs are able to stay in business, right? So it's not a general rule that, you never use gold in your production process because it's just too expensive. That's what the apartment owner says. He says, no, gold's way too expensive to use. But the guy making jewelry, he doesn't say, you can't use gold. No, he can use gold. And so what that means is that the consumers are implicitly telling the entrepreneurs, we would rather have our limited stockpile of gold get channeled into making jewelry rather than getting spread on apartment complexes. Okay, and so of course the consumers, they don't know they're saying that. All they're saying is they're seeing how much, more would I have to pay for an apartment that's coated with gold versus one coated with wallpaper in order to make that profitable, versus how much more would I pay for a gold necklace than for a copper necklace. All right, and just the way it plays out, consumer preferences are such that it makes sense. They would rather that gold go into the necklaces. And so in a market, what makes that happen is the price of gold goes up, right? That these entrepreneurs making the jewelry, when they go into the factor markets and they go to the people who own the gold mines, they can bid more money for that gold. And so the price of gold goes up, rendering it too expensive for these people to use. So then the gold is reserved for this use over here. Right? So that's what it means when the price of gold goes up. So it's not good or bad if the price goes up. That's just a signal that's telling, other entrepreneurs, hands off, this is very scarce, and let's make sure we only use this if it's really something important. So it's gonna be used, and maybe part of what happens, for things like oil, is part of it, it's held for the future, right? That, people don't just pump all the oil today and sell it all today because they look ahead and realize if there were no oil next year, the price would be really high. And so they're not going to sell it all today at whatever it is, $65 a barrel, if they know it would be $300 a barrel next year if everybody sold all their oil today, right? So they keep some of it in the ground and they do a forecast of what prices will be. But that's really just saying they're catering to the consumers of next year. So, this mass of consumers right here isn't just today's consumers. This is all potential consumers when you have a fixed product that you're thinking of marketing it to people. Okay, so I think you guys get the idea of this. And again, this ties into the calculation problem. If you understand why or how Mises thinks the market works and coordinates the use of resources to satisfy the consumers, then you realize why central planning is a bad idea, because you need market prices for these kind of adjustments. Nobody really knows. And we intuitively know that gold shouldn't go into making apartment buildings, but that's really just because we've grown up in a market economy, and that would be so unprofitable, it kind of just jumps out at us. But it's not obvious, 1,001 other little decisions that entrepreneurs have to make, and they're guided by market processes, market prices. Whereas the socialist managers of a factory, they wouldn't have that information. They would just have technological facts in front of them, and it wouldn't be clear. Because you could make apartments covered with gold, and maybe they would do it for, the members of the Politburo and so on. Okay, let me move on. So one of the misconceptions here is people will say, so Mises or anybody who's promoting this idea of serving the consumer, you think that therefore the right thing to do is to make as much money as possible, right? That you're saying, a lawyer or a person who's deciding what to do as a career, they could be a lawyer and make whatever, $200,000 a year, or they could volunteer at the local library and make nothing. And, just live off of their, maybe they're married to Tom Woods or something, and so he just sells books, and so you can do whatever you want, and you volunteer at the library. That's not what Mises is saying, and it's you can think it's either a clever answer or you think it's a trick to get out of it, but what he's saying is, no, there would be implicit consumption there, that really, in a sense, in your role as a consumer, you're abstaining from earning the $200,000 as the lawyer, right? So you're consuming, in a sense, the leisure afforded to you by working at the lighter job. In the same way, suppose you were the lawyer and that, you had a variable amount of clients you could take on, it wouldn't mean that you would have to work the physical limit of your biological capacity, right? I mean, you'd be allowed to take vacations, right? Nobody would push it to that level because you would say, well, no, you can, in a sense, in addition to going on vacation and spending $5,000 on, the resort and so on, you're missing out on the billable hours you could be giving to your clients if you had stayed in New York City working as a lawyer instead of taking a vacation. And so you would just add that into the costs broadly conceived of your vacation as a lawyer. And so by this, and you're allowed to do that. You're allowed to spend money if you earn it as a worker. And so it's really not, it's just a little bit of more of a stretch to say, well, if the lawyer's allowed to take a vacation and he just counts that as part of the opportunity cost, well, then why isn't that worker allowed to in effect take a permanent vacation from the law job and go volunteer at the public library? And he's renouncing all that money, but that's because, he values the psychic satisfaction of working at the library more. He hates working as a lawyer. Okay, so you've got that going on. A couple other examples just to motivate this. Israel Kirzner would use this one. He said, suppose there's a person and he has a job, the guy owns a business, he's got 2 job applicants. One person is, let me just write this so you can see what I'm talking about. Okay, so 2 applicants for the job. So person A is just a stranger, and the employer thinks, okay, this person would bring in $100,000. If I hired this person and he came and did the work, he'd bring in $100,000 in marginal revenue or discounted marginal revenue product. And candidate B is his brother-in-law, right? So his wife's brother, and he's not as good, and he would only bring in $90,000. All right. And maybe we're not like, at the perfect equilibrium here. And so maybe the position advertised, the salary is $85,000. All right. So the guy making the hiring decision thinks, okay, if I hire the brother-in-law, I'll make $5,000, profit or accounting profit on that. Whereas if I hire the stranger, person A, I'll make $15,000. So clearly there's a $10,000 difference there. And it's fine if the person hires the brother-in-law. In other words, that's not a violation of consumer sovereignty. I mean, you might think it's unfair, nepotism and so on, but it's not a violation of what the market economy gives incentives for people to do. And Mises says because there's implicitly what's going on there is a form of consumption. That the guy making the hiring decision is basically spending $10,000 to keep his wife happy. Right? So maybe they just had a big fight. If he went out and bought a $10,000 diamond ring and gave it to her, we wouldn't say that's a violation of consumer sovereignty. We would say, no, he was a consumer and he values his wife not being mad at him anymore. And so given her preferences, she thinks, oh, if he gives me a ring, I'll stop, I'll drop the silent treatment, whatever. All right. So if that's what the preferences are, it's, resources up. So it makes sense for this diamond to go into this ring and get sold to this guy in this shop. And that's fine because he's paying the $10,000 for it, bidding away those resources as a consumer. So that's totally fine. So Mises is just saying, well, it'd be kind of arbitrary. Well, Kerzner would say, I don't know if Mises used this example, but Kerzner, in talking about it, would use this example. So it's, he's basically paying himself $10,000, right? It's money he could have had that now he doesn't have, is the $10,000 from hiring the brother-in-law. So again, it might be right or wrong from some ethical viewpoint, or if he's part of a company and the shareholders hear about that, they might get mad at him because he's basically stealing from the company. But the point is that's an expenditure that he's making as a consumer. So it's not a violation of consumer sovereignty. Okay, let me give you one more example. Is suppose there's a guy who owns a house and he also owns a property next to it that right now is, let me just see how bad, do you guys know what that is, what those are? Okay, alright, so it's not too bad. So he's living next to this, this virgin wood, right? This forest, and Bambi romps in there and everything. There's squirrels that talk like in Disney movies. It's great. So he lives next to there, and then, so he owns it, it's his property, and then a shopping developer comes up to him and says, hey, I'll offer you, whatever, $50,000 for this land because we want to chop it all down and put it in a shopping mall. And this guy says, no, I don't want to do that. That's not a violation of consumer sovereignty because you might say, wait a minute, there's all these potential consumers out here who want to go to a mall and spend money on all the products at the mall, and so they would be ultimately, giving that entrepreneur the money with which to buy the land and all the other resources that go into the mall construction. And yet there's no money flowing into this virgin wood. This guy's not making any money off of it. He's not charging people admission to go hunting or anything. He likes to own that. So isn't he being selfish? He's putting his interests above those of the consumers. But no, that's not a violation of consumer sovereignty because, again, it's this sort of trick of implicit consumption that clearly suppose this guy weren't the owner, suppose he were just someone living here and the actual owner lived over, well, you can't even see it. He lives so far away, it's off the screen. The actual owner lives way over here in a different state. So the old guy over here is who owns this land. And right now it's this, virgin forest. And that guy living right next to it, it's not his property, but he just likes to sit out on his deck and look at the trees and whatever and listen to the birds singing of the property owned by this guy over here out of state. The shopping developer comes up to this guy and says, we'll give you, $50,000 for that land. And then suppose the guy in that house hears about the deal and he calls him He says, whoa, I'll give you $50,000 and $50,001 if you leave it like it is. So this guy says, okay, well, I'm taking the highest bidder, it's fine with me. And so that guy would have paid to keep the land in its state. So clearly there's no issue of consumer sovereignty. It's that he's outbidding other consumers for how to use this scarce resource. And so the point is, nothing really changes economically if we happen to merge the identities of this owner with that consumer. Instead of having him be out of state, what if it's that guy himself? By him refusing the payment, the offer of $50,000, in a sense, it's like he's paying $50,000 to keep this land as it is, because he could have had $50,000 in his pocket. Now he doesn't because he turned down the offer. So he values that more than the $50,000 offer. Okay, so I think you get the idea here. Okay, so does that mean now that Mises says the market economy always does this and that's why we love the market outcome and that's why I'm a classical liberal? No, he doesn't. And Kerzner respects Mises for this, because Kerzner thinks this shows Mises wasn't a dogmatic ideologue, that he really was a positive economist in the sense of, positive versus normative, that he just had the neutral tools of economic science that tell you this is what's going to happen. That Mises did agree that under very rare conditions, it's theoretically possible that in a market economy, there could be a violation of consumer sovereignty, where the market incentives lead the entrepreneurs to act in ways that are detrimental to the wishes of the consumers or to the welfare of the consumers. And it has to do with monopoly. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this too much, because when I get into Rothbard, I'll go over what the response would be. But just be clear, so the idea is when there's a monopoly situation, the entrepreneurs might have the incentive to restrict output. So it's like the standard mainstream critique of monopoly, but it's a little bit more nuanced. In particular, Mises says that it's not just, you don't just have to be a monopolist, you also have to have the demand curve in a certain way that where the competitive output and prices would have been, at that point, the demand curve has to be inelastic. And the reason Mises thought that is he's thinking, because if it's elastic, then when you cut output, you bring in less money, right? Because remember, if it's an inelastic demand curve, you restrict output, you bring in more total revenue. Okay, so Mises is thinking, if you're a monopolist, you're the single, and by that he meant, the single seller of a particular good or service. If the normal competitive output is at an inelastic part of the demand curve, then by restricting output, you're certainly lowering your cost of production, or you're not increasing them by making less output, and you're bringing in more total money. So that's a no-brainer. You would do that as a monopolist, but then isn't that perverse? Because the consumers wanted you to produce at the competitive level, and yet you're restricting production. So Mises thought that's the one example. Now, to be clear, Mises didn't think this was this huge problem in a market economy. He said it quite clearly that in practice, all the monopolies we see, these horrible, clear cases of restricted output, are because of government efforts, interventions, whether it's, efforts to cartelize the domestic industry and then to put up tariff barriers to make sure foreign competition doesn't flood the market at which has the artificially high prices. So Mises isn't saying the government needs to come in and do anything about this, but he's just saying theoretically this is a case where the market could violate consumer sovereignty. Okay. Let's now switch to Rothbard. And incidentally, I have on my Mises archives, I have 2 articles on this stuff. I don't remember what the titles are, but I make a lot of these points, and if you missed a point, you can go there and it's spelled out pretty clearly. Okay, so Rothbard does not like this stuff at all. I mean, obviously he thinks it's important to stress this idea of how the market coordinates decisions over what to do with resources, but he really doesn't like this train of thought. And what he does in Man, Economy, and State is he actually criticizes Hutt. So I'm not sure. I think it's possible if you read Man, Economy, and State, you wouldn't realize that Mises also uses the term consumer sovereignty. So if you're a fan of Rothbard, you say, oh, isn't that sweet? He wanted to spare Mises. And if you think Rothbard's an evil liar, you say, oh, he's hiding the fact. So anyway, that's the 2 interpretations of why he might have done that. But a lot of some of what Rothbard said is more attributable to Hutt. So Hutt's exposition of consumer sovereignty was a lot worse than Mises in terms of the stuff Rothbard's going to bring up. So that's another reason that, you might as well go to the source of all this confusion rather than picking on Mises, who, was picked up some of the language, but actually didn't say things as silly as what Hutt said, talking about consumer sovereignty. So, the main objection is that what Hutt was doing was using this term consumer sovereignty as a benchmark, and where the market fell short of it, he thought there was a role for government intervention, or at least, he was very critical, making it sound as if here's where the market fails to live up to its possibilities. And so Rothbard obviously isn't going to be a fan of that. And he said, look, at this notion of sovereignty is a political concept. And in an actual market economy, there's no such thing as having sovereignty over other people. He said, if anything, what you would say is everyone has individual self-sovereignty. So if you're a producer, no one can force you to do it, to work against your will. You can decide what you want to do. No matter how much money the consumers offer you to be a prize fighter, you don't have to do that if you don't want to do it. And, like the case with the lawyer versus going into the public schools, teaching at the public library, reading the kids at the public library, you can use a sort of convoluted thing to say, well, really, that's consumption, but Rothbard's saying, well, no, why don't we just say producers can do what they want to do, as long as they're respecting their property rights, and consumers can do what they want to do, and we just look at voluntary exchanges of people's property. And it seems a little bit biased or misleading to just say, oh, really, it's the consumers who are doing everything, when no, it's a bunch of people who have property and they're all just exchanging, voluntary property transactions. So individual self-sovereignty is what Rothbard said. If we want to use this term sovereignty, that's really what it is in a system of what we would call Rothbardian anarchy. Another problem is Rothbard says, look, even on its own terms, saying that the market is a democratic election where every penny spent is a vote cast, he says that's unfair to markets. That sort of doesn't give them their due, because in a political election, the majority wins and the losers have to just suck it up, right? If you're in the 49% minority and you lose to the other guy, that person might be awful and you're stuck with that person's policies. Whereas in a market economy, if you have, really big feet, you don't have to wear the shoe that caters to the majority. You can, there's very specialized niche markets, or, you go to a big and tall store and you get suits that, wouldn't fit most people, but they fit you because there is a small role for that. And so entrepreneurs in the market can cater to very small minorities, whereas that can't happen in the political process. There's a winner-take-all outcome. So he says in that respect, it's, like I say, it's very misleading, and it doesn't give the market its due to say it's like an election that's held every day. He also criticizes the very notion of a competitive price or quantity against which to measure the market output. Right? He said there's no such thing as the competitive amount. There's the free market output. And then to try to say, oh wait, that's a monopoly price, that's a monopoly quantity, because I'm comparing it to some competitive amount. What does that even mean? So to give you an example, Bill Gates comes out and he invents, these new, Microsoft comes out and people flock to his operating system. And in a sense, yeah, there might be a higher output measured in some dimension if there were 1,000 other Bill Gates who had produced comparable products. Right? Or, pick somebody else. Michael Jordan. If there were 1,000 more Michael Jordans, maybe there'd be more basketball output, and it would be more exciting to watch the NBA, and the returns to the first Michael Jordan would probably be lower, right? And he wouldn't have all this ad revenue because he wouldn't be so special. But yet there'd be more total basketball enjoyment going on. So that might be true, but what's the point? That's not what's happening in the real world. Right now, there's just one Bill Gates, there's one Michael Jordan, and the market's rewarding them accordingly. And they're producing a certain amount, and it's all voluntary, and everyone gains from each individual transaction, at least ex ante. So what's the problem? And it seems odd to come up with this hypothetical competitive level of output that's higher than what's happening right now, when the conditions to make it that way just aren't true. So what kind of critique is that? I think there was another lecture where they got more into the Rothbard's critique of monopoly. So let me just deal with this issue of consumer sovereignty directly, because I think this is pretty clever. Rothbard takes what you'd think would be the worst case scenario, and this is what Kerzner used at NYU when he was trying to motivate Mises' point on this. So the idea is, look, come on, we can stop being a dogmatic Austrian, just admit that there is a hypothetical scenario where clearly entrepreneurs aren't doing what's in the best interest of consumers, and that's the case where they physically destroy the product, right? So it's true empirically if you find cases where farmers are destroying crops or they're killing pigs, it's because the government paid them to do that or ordered them to do it, right? Like during the 1930s, it's true, as John Steinbeck pointed out in the Grapes of Wrath, one of the most horrifying, moving passages. I think it's actually the passage where it says the Grapes of Wrath in it. Steinbeck talks about starving people. I think they're outside of a fence looking in, and there's all these oranges that the owners are dousing with gasoline. You say, why are they doing that? Because they're destroying the oranges. They're throwing them out. They're not selling them, but they don't want to just put them by the dumpster because all the starving people are going to eat them. And so they're dousing with gasoline to make sure nobody can eat these things. We're taking them out of circulation to raise the price of oranges. And so, Steinbeck's looking at, oh my God, that's horrible. This is the greedy capitalist system. Look what it's forcing people to do. But no, that would be silly for any individual orange producer to do. It was because the government came in and cartelized agriculture and ordered the farmers to do that, and the farmers willingly did it because with the government there to make sure everyone did that, they raised the price of oranges or whatever the thing happened to be. So it's true that there were pigs slaughtered at the same time that the government was announcing a shortage of food. And so the government on the one hand was telling farmers destroy food, on the other hand saying we got to suck it up, people, let's raise taxes because there's a food shortage on, right? And that's what the government actually did during the 1930s. But anyway, Mises and Kerzner are saying, even though empirically it's usually not the market doing it, theoretically, suppose somebody does corner the market through purely private means, owns all of a particular product that's especially a perishable product. It wouldn't make sense to do it with something durable. You would just store it. But some perishable product, they might not dump it all on the market. They might bring in less total revenue if they sell the whole thing on the market rather than if they just hold some off, and they could literally destroy it. And so clearly it seems you've got valuable product here, the consumers want it, something's messed up if the market incentives leads the person to physically destroy some of it. Okay, so Rothbard wants to tackle this case because that seems like, a clear-cut case where how's Rothbard gonna deal with this? Okay, so he says, first of all, it would just be a one-shot mistake that let's say it's coffee. You own all the coffee in the world, or you own such a huge portion of the market that you can significantly move the price. And he says, okay, you plant so much, you harvest it, and you realize, you're looking at the sales figures and stuff, and you realize, what, if we sold all of this coffee we just had, got harvested, we'll make less money than if we destroyed 10% of it. So let's do that. He said, okay, you might do it that year, but he said next planting season, you're going to plant less, right? Because it's still wasteful to have, to produce that much coffee and then destroy 10%. It would make more sense. You'd make even more money if you only planted 90% next time around and then freed up that land to plant something else that you would sell. Okay, so he said at worst here we're talking about a one-shot mistake, or, every year it would just be how much you were off a little bit one way or the other. There wouldn't be these huge systematic errors leading you to do mass destruction year after year. That would be stupid. Okay, so that's one thing. We're sort of containing the problem. He said, okay, but even that 1 year where you do happen to have this surplus is on your hands and you think, I can make more money if I only sell 90% of it. He says that even here it's a little bit tricky, or what's involved here is not what we normally do in praxeology, because in praxeology, we see somebody's action and we can infer or we explain it by saying they must have preferences and they prefer to do that over other possible alternatives. But we don't have to get inside their head to see what's the psychological motivation for it. As praxeologists, we're just very neutral and formal and just say that if we're going to call that thing an action, we assume there must have been some motivation and that the person preferred doing that to something else. But we don't say, oh, the reason he did that, the reason he preferred it is because actually, why did he put that sweater on? It's because he's cold. I mean, that's a psychological explanation, or that's part of understanding, but that's actually not a praxeological thing. You would say he put the sweater on because he preferred doing that to not putting it on, right? I mean, so that's the distinction. So what Rothbard's pointing out here is that if we want to criticize the person burning the coffee to make more money, notice that you have to get inside their head. You have to know specifically why they're burning it. It's not just an issue of, that they're doing something bad if they prefer to burn the coffee than to sell it on the market. So that the person could be a pyromaniac. What if the reason they're burning that coffee is because they just want to see it go up? And that seems kind of contrived, but what if we're talking about fireworks, right? If somebody has owns a firework plant and produces so many units and then takes 10% of them to his backyard and calls over all his buddies and they shoot them off and get wasted and watch it blow up in the backyard, no one's going to say, oh, that's just really you're trying to gyp the consumers. You say, no, I own these things and this is what you do with fireworks. We're watching them blow up. What are you talking about? I'm consuming 10% of what I produced at the office today. Right? So that's clearly not a violation of consumer sovereignty. So again, if he happened to be a pyromaniac and just wanted to say, hey, I love the smell of burnt coffee in the morning, right? It burns 10% of the crop. That's totally fine. I mean, that's a little bit weird, but there's nothing praxeologically wrong with that. And so Rothbard's saying that, so in order for us to condemn this person as violating consumer sovereignty, it's not enough that he destroys the product that could have been sold, which would have at the same time lowered unit prices. It's also we have to know specifically, psychologically, why is he doing it? Because if it's just to make more money, then that's bad. But if it's for some other reason, it's okay. So again, that seems kind of weird. It seems like in his role as a consumer, we have to evaluate the type of end he's doing. That if his end is, I like to see stuff burn, that's okay. But if his end is, I like to get more money in my pocket, then that's not okay. All right. So Rothbard's point is that it gets a little weird, and that seems inconsistent with other types of praxeology. Okay, I'll actually stop right there because I know a lot of these times people have tons of questions. So in the beginning, if you have questions about this stuff, let's do those first, and then if we still have time left over, you can ask all sorts of things. Yep.
Is it even possible to destroy wealth with the intention of, like you were saying, if a farmer wanted to destroy coffee to increase his revenue, is that even possible?
So the question is it even possible to destroy crops to increase the market value of the remainder?
If you were doing it on your own free will, would it be possible for me as a farmer to destroy crops to actually increase my revenue?
Not if you were a small farmer, right? Because if you just controlled 1% of the total crop and you destroy 1% of yours, you're probably not going to raise prices that much. But I mean, it is true that if you could control the whole industry, it might make sense to restrict output. I mean, that's what cartels do. That's why if you can have a cartel, it works.
Would they actually destroy stuff or just restrict what's on the market currently?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's partly what Rothbard's talking about. So if it's a durable good, if you're making television sets, you're not going to give guys baseball bats and break the sets. You're just going to sell them, just trickle out the sales. But if it's something that's going to deteriorate anyway, I mean, you're in effect saying, am I going to sell it all right now or let some of it be wasted? So yeah, I mean, but there are cases, they have burned crops. Now you're saying, well, that's because the government told them to do it, but they did make more money. I mean, the farmers who are ordered to destroy their crops and whatever, they're in favor of that they do make more money. The reason they wouldn't do it without the government is because they need the government to make sure all their competitors do it too. It doesn't make sense to do it individually, but if they all do it together, it might make sense. Okay. I think you...
Yeah, it all has to do with demand, consumer demand. So if whatever the consumer wants, they would have to supply. So yeah, even if they did restrict supply, it wouldn't mean it was bad. In itself, it would mean that they're just trying to meet the demands, specific demands of the consumer. Am I getting that right? Pretty much.
Yeah, so he's saying, one way to talk about what Rothbard is saying is that they're, in a sense, they are catering to the demands of the consumers as expressed by how much they're willing to pay. And so, the fact that they make more money, restricting output in a loose sense, consistent with everything else, they're satisfying the consumers. Rothbard actually makes a slightly different point. He says, look, if we as consumers don't like that outcome, then we can just make it so our demand curve's not inelastic, right? So what you were asking, it's not always true that you want to restrict output. It depends on the circumstances. So, and the way you know that is because they don't restrict output to zero, right? I was just picking 10%, but the point is you start saying, okay, let's not sell all the coffee this year that we have. They don't just sell one bean of it, right? It might make sense to cut back somewhat, but at some point they stop because if they cut back even more, even though prices go up, it wouldn't offset the reduction in quantity. So that's the idea. You restrict it until the point at which total revenue is maximized.
Yeah. Is that just like a temporary fix for like a miscalculation problem? Because it wouldn't make sense for year after year for them to devote valuable land and resources for growing something that they're going to ultimately destroy. It just seems like it's a temporary fix. So like when we miscalculated, it actually makes more sense for us not to sell this product. It'll cost us more on the aggregate. So I mean, we're not going to do that. But it wouldn't make sense for a company to like have this be a strategy because there's other use for that land and time it takes to grow those products.
Right. So she was saying, at worst, this is going to be a one-shot mistake, and then they're going to readjust because they don't want to keep overproducing year after year. And yeah, that's I think Rothbard's like first main point is he's limiting the problem, and then he says, but let's now just tackle that even small thing too. You just actually made me realize something. This happens all the time in a market. I mean, it's ubiquitous, but like as she's saying that. It's a minimal problem. Like I used to work in a dairy department in a grocery store. We'd stock the yogurt and whatever, and there were expiration dates on this. That was one of the things the meat department was worse than we were, but we really had to watch the expiration. The clowns in grocery, they could just put up Cheerios. They could be there for 8 months. It wouldn't matter. But we had to make sure that Dannon yogurt, you had to get it out of there if it was expired, and there would be plenty of times where stuff would expire on the shelf and we'd have to take it off and throw it out. Or they actually might have given it to the homeless shelter. I don't know if they were allowed to eat the expired stuff. But in any event, they actually probably weren't allowed. It was probably illegal, and we thought, well, that's stupid. They would rather get slightly expired yogurt. But the point is, that right there is kind of what we're talking about here. We realized, we could have moved that stuff. We could have had a sale. And we could have said, we could have paid customers to come in and take it. This stuff's gotta go. It's gonna go bad 2 days from now. So we clearly could have found a price that would have moved all the products so we didn't have to throw any of it out. But we didn't do that. We kept a higher price, sold a lower amount, knowing full well that we might have to throw some of this stuff out. And of course, the manager tries to order it so that doesn't happen. But on the other hand, we don't want to run out either. You really don't want someone to come in who says, you've got no strawberry yogurt. You don't want that to happen either. So actually, in serving the consumers over time, it makes sense for us to go over what we think so that, there's a very rare chance we'll run out, and normally we'll have enough, and there'll be just a little bit of slippage, and we'll, throw out a few packages every month. And so, but the customers know when I show up, it's at a decent price, and there's always strawberry yogurt sitting right there that's not expired, right? So that's the way you in a sense are serving the consumers over the long run versus if we did it so that we always had to move all of it, we would make less total money, and maybe we would stop doing it, right? So if Hut came along or even Mises and said, no, you are forbidden from ever throwing out product, you have to always adjust the spot price to move it, we might stop offering it altogether, depending on the margins, because it's not like you make a bunch of money on Dannon yogurt, right? So clearly that wouldn't be helping consumers. So that's a point I hadn't realized there. Okay, yep.
Say something that is not reversible. So I'm going to be a tree hunter just for a minute.
Okay.
Millions of acres of rainforest. Cattle companies come down and say, look, we're going to cut down these trees and we're going to put in cattle ranches. Because that's the better use, is by having cattle at cheaper feed prices. So certainly consumers are benefiting from that. Better use of the land that are just sitting trees. So like I said, they continue this practice, and all of a sudden, atmospheric concentrations of oxygen decrease to the point where it's getting hard to breathe. It's getting hard to turn on life.
Mm-hmm.
That's not reversible because of the fact that it may take 20 years to replant some of that land back in the rainforest.
Yeah, okay, so the question is, what if it's a situation where there's a negative or positive externalities, depending how you frame it, that it might make sense the owner of a forest, even if it's a private owner, to sell it off and clear the land so that cattle can come in, because the trick, what's happening there is the consumers around the world are not bidding for lower temperatures, or there's not a market mechanism for them to be able to bid away for the scarce atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases and so on. So I don't want to. That's a pretty big topic. I don't want to get into that too much right here. I do have a working paper on what would the free market response be to global warming. Let's assume the alarmist climate models are correct, and that it is true that something needs to be done quickly. Suppose we just had all, Rothbardian societies all over the world, what would happen. And it's kind of a complicated subject to get into right now, but that's what's going on in your example. So there's a missing market. And so, yeah, then the issue is, should the government do something, or should we try to allow the market to foster a solution to that?
I get questions like that from my colleagues all the time.
Right. Right. So, but yeah, so that is the trick, is that the consumers aren't being allowed by construction to bid for the scarce atmospheric resources. So that's why that's happening.
Or they really don't care as much as they do.
Well, sure. Yeah, I mean, so technically, you're right that you could have she said they really don't care as much as they say they do. So it's true, the Sierra Club could come in and buy that forest, but the issue is they don't have enough money behind them. Whereas if all the consumer, because everyone, let's say the world really would end in 50 years if they do this. So in theory, everybody should be willing to pay enough to prevent their own destruction, right? But it's, there's a what do you call that? A tragedy of the commons, and there's all those sort of game theoretic issues where, well, why should I contribute? It's a public good, all right? So that stuff all gets in there, and then those objections are all true. But just to give you a quick answer, people saying, oh, there's this tragedy of the commons, or it's a public good, and so that's why it's hard for the market to solve the problem. Okay, but by the same token, it's hard to get all the 200 countries, or however many countries there are, to all coordinate and do that. That right now, if the U.S. caps its emissions of CO2, that gives China and Russia and India an even greater incentive not to cap theirs, because that means industry is going to move from here over there. And so you still have this coordination problem. You don't fix it. You reduce the number of actors, that's true. Instead of having 6 billion people, you reduce it to whatever, 250 scoundrels who run all the governments of the world. But, it's odd to assume that, the way we're going to get cooperative behavior is to restrict it to people who literally start wars. That seems kind of an odd way to put your faith in. Yep.
How does analysis apply to the diamond markets? So, I don't know the name of the company, I think it's Debeers.
Yeah.
Basically, the cartel over diamonds. They did very good marketing to have a kind of psychic value associated with diamonds.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why they still mine it, but basically they store like the vast majority of the diamonds.
Okay, so he's asking about diamonds and the De Beers, and is it South Africa? Is that I think they?
Well, they control South African mines, but also Russian mines.
Oh, okay, and it's not just South Africa. So anyway, there's this family that controls a lot of the diamond mines, and the typical charge is, that's a great example of a private monopoly or near monopoly, and they restrict output. First of all, they're not physically destroying anything. All they're doing is slowing the rate of extraction, which is ironically what environmentalists normally want, right? They're saving diamonds for the future. Give them a break. These guys are altruists. I'm kind of making a joke, but seriously, isn't that? The market's always wrong. Oh, it over extracts oil. We're producing too much oil. There's not going to be enough for future generations. Okay, what about the case of diamonds? Well, no, they don't produce enough, right? So it's not a consistent worldview. It's just whatever the market is doing in any particular industry, that's bad. So they're not destroying anything. That's one thing. And then again, Rothbard would say, what is this hypothetical competitive price and output? What are you talking about? The consumers are happy. They bought the diamond mines, the people who sold them the ownership rights. Now, I don't know in practice. Maybe they had agreements with the South African government or whatever. So, it's possible. Let me just say this more generally. Just be careful, armed with your, a priori defense of pure market capitalism. Don't go out and start saying, big businesses in the real world are serving consumers. You don't know that they are. Because a lot of them are, tied in with the government, and they actually are doing real shady things. And so a lot of times, I'm a lot more sympathetic to leftists who are critical of globalization and stuff like that, because there are some insidious things going on, but it's not a pure market economy, obviously. The reason they're able to do this stuff and the reason they don't get punished through competition is because the government intervenes and shields them from it.
If we're generous and we assume De Beers isn't doing anything nasty, which I would guess that they probably are, isn't it analogous to a consumer saving for future? Because really they're saving diamonds like somebody might stockpile gold as an investment. I mean, if I did that, no one would consider me evil, but a larger, maybe expanded out.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. She's saying, people stockpile, hoard gold is an investment in wealth. So isn't that clearly what the Debeers family is doing? If they're literally doing that. If they restrict output, it's because they think it's more profitable to hold on to some of it. The one part I would differ with you is you said no one would call you evil for hoarding gold. Yes, they would. And I think we'll see that in the next few years when, gold prices go up to 2,500 and the president has to make a special press conference. Yeah.
I think the foundation of consumer sovereignty is that we are not in a barter economy. The consumer has money. Because otherwise everybody will be in the same position. Everybody will be producing. Does have or misses account specifically for that?
Sorry, can you say that again? I didn't.
The foundation of consumer sovereignty is that we are not in a barter economy. We are in a money economy. So consumer has the money. It has the possibility to buy or not to buy. When he does not buy, the producer cannot wait. He's just saying, sell me more for that price or improve your quality. Otherwise, you are out. The consumer is not forced to buy. Because otherwise, everybody will be a producer. We will be in a barter economy. I sell my labor, you sell your services.
Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah, so his point is, let me reword it, I think, that in a barter economy, there's not this clear dichotomy between the consumers and the producers when two people, the tailor and the butcher exchange, sewing services for meat. You can't say, wait, who's the buyer and who's the seller? They're both at the same time. And so it's only with the use of money that there's this functional distinction between people in their role as consumers versus their role as producers. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I don't think I don't remember anyone bringing that up before.
I think Menger's implicit thing is when he says that the most liquid good commands you more power in the market. So you choose that to exchange. That's why people move from barter to indirect exchange. That's where the consumer sovereignty. But I don't know if had or misses explicitly say that because I think that's the point.
Yeah, I don't think right.
Hyperinflation, consumer is not a sovereign. He must run to buy anything. He doesn't choose. He can't wait.
I understand. So he's saying, in a hyperinflation, doesn't the consumer lose his sovereignty because he has to just exchange the money for anything? That's a good question. I don't know what Mises or Hutt would say about that. I don't remember them ever dwelling on that, but you're right. That does seem like that's part of what is driving the intuition here. Okay, why don't we take one more? Yeah.
In terms of software where after you produce develop the software, almost zero, you produce one more copy.
Right.
From the consumer's perspective, it would be nice to have 1 million copies because the more customers will be served. But companies like to restrict the use of the software by setting a high price. So how justify the consumer investment in the case?
Right. So the question is, in something like software or also like the development of a new drug or something, there could be high fixed costs of production, but then once you've got the thing, you understand how to make it, the marginal cost of making subsequent units is really low. And so, isn't it true that the firm could make a lot more than they do, but they, in a sense, restrict output to raise revenue? Yeah, they certainly do that. I'm trying to remember. I don't know if this is true, so don't take this as gospel, but I think there is an issue where it's really tricky in a neoclassical framework to deal with cases like this, where, they have to at least exceed average total cost, otherwise they're losing money, but yet if marginal cost is basically zero, then how do you do this? Another example is airlines. They won't, every flight you get on is not jam-packed. Right? That sometimes they decide we'd rather keep ticket prices high and only sell 75% of the seats. Right? Or movie theaters do the same thing. They don't adjust their price to make sure the theater is jam-packed to capacity every single show. Right? And so it kind of goes back to the yogurt example I gave. So, it might be a problem in terms of a neoclassical model. I'd have to think about it more, but it's clearly in terms of Rothbardian or even Misesian consumer sovereignty, once you look at the big picture, that's fine. Okay, let me stop there, and then I can stay up here for questions. Thanks.